My father-in-law told me I wasn't real family at Thanksgiving, so I handed him an eviction notice with the turkey. The dining room was beautiful, filled with the scent of rosemary and roasted bird. I had spent 48 hours in this kitchen, my joints aching as I basted a 20-pound turkey to golden perfection. I sat at the head of the table, watching my family. Then, my father-in-law, Arthur, stood up. He clinked his glass of expensive Merlot, a wine I had paid for, and looked around the room. "A toast," he announced, his voice booming. He looked at his son, Pete, and his daughter, Mindy. "To the real blood of this family. To the legacy that stays within our veins. And to those who are just lucky guests." The room went ice cold. He turned his gaze slowly toward me, his eyes filled with a mean, sharp glint. "Know your place, girl," he sneered. "You are just the help we let sleep in the master suite." The clatter of a fork hitting a plate was the only sound in the room. I looked at my husband, Pete, waiting for him to roar in my defense. Instead, he stared down at his mound of stuffing, suddenly very interested in the herbs. Arthur didn't stop there. He leaned back, acting like a king in a castle that wasn't his. He started a long speech about the family legacy. He talked about how this house, with its crown molding and marble floors, would only ever belong to true heirs. He made it sound like I was a stray dog they had kindly taken in off the street. Finally, he wiped his mouth and looked at me again. "I'm moving my office into your craft room tomorrow," he stated. "I don't need permission from a stranger to use my family's property." I felt a familiar sting of his cruelty, but this time it felt different. Arthur had been a bully since the very first day I married Pete, always whispering that I wasn't good enough for their name. He acted like he owned the world, but he had a very short memory. What Arthur didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this family home had been a breath away from being lost forever. 5 years ago, during Arthur's bad investment phase, the bank had moved in to take everything. He had cried in private, terrified of losing his status. I was the one who stepped in. I didn't do it for him. I did it to save the roof over my husband's head. I bought the debt quietly using my own hard-earned savings. I owned every brick through an LLC named CJ Justice. After dinner, the house felt heavy with the weight of Arthur's insults. I found Pete in the kitchen, pretending to scrub a pot. "He insulted me in my own home, Pete," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of hurt and rising anger. "He called me a guest. He called me the help. Are you really going to let him talk to me like that?" Pete sighed, a sound of pure cowardice. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. "He's just old-fashioned, Linda," he muttered. "He's getting older. It's his house, his rules. Just apologize for whatever made him grumpy so we can finally have dessert." I felt my heart break into a million pieces. Pete wasn't just staying quiet to keep the peace. He had been lying to his father for years, telling Arthur that he was the one paying the mortgage. If you want to see how I handle a husband who betrays his own wife, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. I walked away from Pete, my mind racing back to 5 years ago. I remembered the long nights when I worked 3 different jobs just to stay afloat. My eyes used to be bloodshot from lack of sleep, and my hands would shake from too much caffeine and too much stress. I did it all because Pete had cried about his childhood memories and how losing this house would kill his spirit. I sacrificed my health and my peace to save his pride. I remembered the exact night I sat in a dim office and signed the final papers that made me the secret owner. Pete had hugged me that night, whispering promises. He told me, "I'll make sure you're always the queen of this castle, Linda." Looking at him now, I realized those words were just empty air. I walked into my bedroom, ready to collapse, but I stopped dead in the middle of the rug. Arthur's heavy leather suitcases were splayed across my duvet. My handmade silk pillows, the ones I had bought to celebrate my promotion, were tossed carelessly onto the hardwood floor like trash. Arthur was standing by the closet, pulling my dresses off the hangers. "I've decided the stairs are too much for my knees," he said, not even looking up. He spoke as if he were giving an order to a maid. "You and Pete can sleep in the basement. It's cooler down there anyway, and you won't be in the way of the family." Before I could even scream, I saw Pete walk in behind him. He wasn't stopping his father. Instead, Pete was already picking up my nightstand, carrying it toward the dark basement stairs. The basement was cold, damp, and smelled like old cardboard boxes. We had spent years ignoring this part of the house, and now it was my bedroom. Pete fell asleep almost instantly, snoring as if he hadn't just helped his father kick me out of my own bed. I couldn't sleep. I sat on a dusty wooden crate, the glow of my laptop screen lighting up the dark corner. I logged into the CJ Justice portal, the company I used to own the house. My eyes widened as I saw a new maintenance request filed just an hour ago.
Arthur had used the house account to hire a crew.
He wanted to have the eyesore rose garden, the one I had planted in memory of my late mother, ripped out to make room for a putting green. The next morning, I didn't scream or cry. I woke up early and changed my strategy. I put on the floral dress Pete always loved and made his favorite breakfast, blueberries and cream waffles. I acted completely defeated, bowing my head whenever Arthur walked into the room. "You're right, Pete," I said softly, touching his arm. "Your dad is getting older. He deserves the best room in the house." I was being selfish. I watched Pete's chest swell with pride as I lured him into a false sense of security. I made him feel like the man of the house while I served them both like a servant. While Pete was in the shower, feeling happy that I had finally submitted, I grabbed his keys. I ran to the garage and made a quick, perfect copy of his hidden key, the one for Arthur's private safe. Do you think a wife should ever steal from her husband's secrets? Hit subscribe for more of this revenge story. While the men were out at the golf course, bragging about their power, I went to work. My heart hammered against my ribs as I entered Arthur's study. I moved the heavy painting and found the safe. The copied key turned with a smooth, sickening click. I expected to find stacks of stolen cash or maybe some gold bars he had hidden from the taxman. Instead, I found a thick bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. My hands shook as I pulled the first one out. They weren't business papers or bank statements. They were deeply personal letters from a woman named Sarah. As I read the first page, my blood turned to ice. Sarah was Arthur's other daughter, a secret child that Pete and Mindy didn't even know existed. I sat on the floor, reading through the letters. Sarah was clearly struggling. She lived in a rusted trailer 3 towns over, barely making enough money to buy groceries for her kids. All while Arthur lived in luxury on my dime, eating steak and drinking fine wine. I realized something even worse as I looked at the check stubs tucked into the envelopes. Arthur had been sending Sarah family money every single month. But Arthur didn't have any money. The cash he was sending to his secret daughter was actually coming from the monthly allowance I gave to Pete for our household bills. My husband was funding his secret sister's life with my hard-earned salary. I found one final letter where Arthur wrote, "Don't worry, Sarah. I'm pushing the outsider out soon. Then you can have her room." I pulled into the driveway that afternoon and my heart stopped. A loud, yellow bulldozer was idling on the front lawn, its heavy treads crushing the grass. My mother's roses, the bushes I had nurtured for 20 years, were gone. They were nothing but broken sticks and tangled roots tossed into a messy pile of dirt. Arthur was standing there, leaning on a golf club and smirking as the dust swirled around his expensive shoes. He looked at me with a cold, triumphant smile that made my stomach turn. "Much better," he shouted over the noise of the engine. "Now it finally looks like a man lives here, not some sentimental gardener." I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I simply pulled out my phone, took a high-resolution photo of the destruction, and sent it to my lawyer. My message was only one word: execute. An hour later, Pete's sister, Mindy, arrived for the long holiday weekend. She didn't even say hello to me as she walked through the front door. Instead, she took a pack of neon pink post-it notes out of her designer purse. She began walking through the house, sticking them on everything she liked. She put a note on the crystal vase, the silver tea set, and even the velvet sofa. "Mindy's," the notes shouted in bold ink. She looked at me over her shoulder and laughed. "Dad said I could have the fine china and the living room set when you move out next month, Linda," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "He said you'd probably prefer something more plastic for your next little apartment." I realized then that the whole family had already planned my exit. The following morning was Sunday. I decided to host one last family brunch to keep them unsuspecting. I put on a bright smile that felt like a mask and served chilled mimosas in my best crystal flutes. I laughed at Arthur's bad jokes and listened to Mindy talk about her upcoming vacation. I acted bubbly and light, telling them all that I had a special announcement to share at the end of the meal. The table was full of expensive food I had paid for, and they were all eating like kings. Suddenly, Arthur slammed his hand on the table and interrupted me. "I have an announcement too, everyone," he said, his voice full of pride. "Since we have so much extra space now, I've invited Sarah to move into this house on Monday." The table went completely silent. Pete and Mindy looked at each other, their faces filled with confusion. "Who on earth is Sarah, Dad?" Mindy asked, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Arthur took a slow sip of his drink, enjoying the drama. He explained that he was expanding the family by bringing in his other daughter. He looked at me with a cruel, sideways glance. He told them that since I was just a guest and wasn't real blood, I didn't get a vote in who lived under his roof. He was acting like he was the master of the estate, giving away rooms that didn't belong to him. I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Actually, Arthur, you're right, I said quietly. Let's talk about the guests in this house. Do you think Arthur is about to get exactly what he deserves? Hit subscribe for more of this revenge story. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen. I returned a moment later carrying a heavy silver serving tray with a polished metal dome on top. It looked like I was bringing out another course of the meal. I didn't have time to roast another turkey, I said, my voice echoing through the silent dining room. But I have something on this platter that I think you will find even more satisfying than a meal. Pete looked nervous, and Mindy looked annoyed, but Arthur just looked greedy, probably expecting a box of cigars or a new watch. I placed the tray in the center of the table, right in front of Arthur's plate. With a quick, firm motion, I lifted the silver dome. Inside was a thick stack of brightly colored legal papers. I watched Arthur's eyes drop to the tray. He expected a gift, but his face twisted into a look of pure confusion as he saw the legal headers. I reached down and handed the very top paper directly to him. It was neon yellow, so bright it hurt to look at. It's an eviction notice, Arthur, I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. The clock is already ticking. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my premises. For a few seconds, the room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. Then, Arthur burst out laughing. He laughed so hard he started to cough, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. You finally lost your mind, Linda, he shouted. You can't evict me from my own house. This is my family's legacy. You're just a guest who stayed too long. This hasn't been your house since 2019, Arthur, I said. The laughter died instantly. I reached back into the stack and pulled out the original deed. I slid it slowly across the table, watching it glide over the white tablecloth until it hit his wine glass. It listed Chloe Jane Johnson as the sole owner. I am C.J. Justice, I whispered. I bought your debt when you were drowning. I paid the taxes you ignored. I saved this roof while you were busy pretending to be a millionaire. Pete's face went completely white, the color of a ghost. He looked like he was going to be sick. Linda, wait, he stammered, his hands shaking. I told Dad that I was the one paying the bank every month. I told him it was our money. I know exactly what you told him, Pete, I said, turning to look at my husband with nothing but pity. I've heard the lies you've been feeding him for years. But bank statements don't lie, and neither do land records. I tapped the deed with my finger. Every single cent used to keep this roof over your head came from my career, my long nights, and my sacrifices. None of it came from your allowance or your father's imaginary fortune. Mindy suddenly lunged across the table, trying to grab the deed so she could rip it up. I was faster. I pinned the paper down with my palm before she could touch it. And you? I said, looking at her. Take your ridiculous post-it notes off my property before I call the police and have you charged with vandalism. Is there anything more satisfying than watching a bully realize they have no power? Hit subscribe for more revenge. Arthur's face went from purple to a sickly gray. He suddenly clutched his chest, gasping for air and slumped back into his chair. My heart, he groaned, his voice weak and trembling. You're killing me, Linda. You're heartless. You're attacking a sick old man in his own home. He was playing the old man card, trying to make me look like the villain in front of the others. Pete jumped up to help him, looking at me with pure accusation. I didn't move an inch. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. I've got the paramedics on speed dial, Arthur, I said coldly. Should I tell them you're faking a heart attack to avoid an eviction? Or should we let them see your medical records I found in the safe? The ones that say you're as healthy as a horse. The fake heart attack ended instantly. Arthur sat up, his eyes full of pure venom. The house was in total chaos as they realized I wasn't joking. By midnight, Arthur was frantically scurrying through the halls, trying to hide his treasures in his suitcases. I didn't go to sleep. I stood in the hallway with a clipboard and a flashlight, checking every single item he tried to drag toward the door. I was a sentry guarding my castle. As he tried to wrap a heavy porcelain vase in his coat, I stepped in his way. That's my mother's antique vase, Arthur, I said, my voice echoing through the empty-feeling house. Put it back on the shelf right now. If you try to walk out that door with it, the police will meet you at the curb. The next morning, I did something Arthur never expected. I found the number for Sarah, the secret half-sister he had hidden away in that rusted trailer. My heart pounded as she picked up the phone. I didn't hold back. I told her the absolute truth. Arthur wasn't a rich man living on an estate he earned. He was a squatter living on my charity. I told her how he had been using her as a pawn, promising her a room that belonged to the woman he was trying to ruin. He told me you were a gold digger, Linda, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking over the line. He said you stole his fortune and that he was just trying to take back what was his. I felt a wave of sadness for her. Arthur had poisoned her mind just to keep his lies alive. I invited Sarah to come to the house immediately. When she pulled into the driveway in her battered old car, she looked up at the mansion with wide, fearful eyes. She walked inside and saw the reality of the situation. She saw me, an older woman who had worked her fingers to the bone, and she saw the legal papers proving Arthur's deceit. Sarah looked at her father, who was still clutching a bag of stolen silverware, with pure disgust. You used me, Dad, she said, her voice shaking with rage. You used me as a threat against the only person who was actually being kind to you. You told me she was the enemy while you were eating her food. Arthur couldn't even look at her. He just stared at the floor, his face red with shame. At exactly 8 a.m., the sound of a power drill echoed through the foyer. The locksmith had arrived right on time. He began changing every single lock on every single door, from the front entrance to the back mudroom. Arthur was still in his silk pajamas, standing on the porch and screaming at the neighbors like a madman. He looked small and pathetic out there in the morning light. I walked out and tossed a heavy black trash bag onto the lawn. It landed with a wet thud in the muddy hole where my mother's roses used to bloom. Your golf clubs, Arthur, I said, pointing at the mud. They belong in the dirt, just like the memories you destroyed. He looked at the bag, then at me, realizing he was finally on the outside looking in. The house was finally quiet, but the storm was just beginning. Arthur had moved into a cheap, neon-lit motel down the road. Pete stayed behind, begging me for one more chance to prove he could be a husband. I gave him a choice. He could stay in the basement, but only if he paid me actual rent every Friday. He also had to work as my full-time gardener, spending his weekends in the dirt to restore every single rose bush he had helped destroy. Pete agreed, looking like a beaten dog. But my trust was gone. 3 nights later, I caught him at the basement window. He was sneaking a plate of my homemade lasagna and a bottle of wine out to Arthur, who was hiding in the shadows of the bushes. Can a marriage ever survive this much lying? Hit subscribe to see how I handle a double-crossing husband. The grand reckoning had officially begun. I realized Arthur hadn't just been stealing my peace, he had been stealing my future. I sat down with a glass of water and my laptop to perform a deep financial audit. I discovered that Arthur had been using a family trust account, one that I had funded for our retirement, to pay for Mindy's luxury car lease for 3 years. He had forged my signature on the documents, treating my hard-earned savings like his private piggy bank. My blood boiled as I saw the totals. I didn't call him to argue. Instead, I called the bank and the leasing company. I froze the trust immediately and reported the forged signatures as fraud. I wanted them to feel the cold reality of life without my money. The fallout was beautiful and fast. Mindy was at a high-end hair salon, getting her expensive highlights done, when the repo man arrived. He hooked her luxury SUV to the tow truck right in front of the big glass windows for everyone to see. She had to walk home in her salon cape because her credit cards were also declined. Meanwhile, Arthur tried to go to his gentleman's club to hide from his problems and complain about his evil daughter-in-law. He didn't get past the front desk. I was the actual owner of the buildings leased through my LLC, and I had canceled his membership the hour he was evicted. He was escorted out by security in front of all his powerful friends, looking like the fraud he truly was. As I dug deeper into the family's secrets, I found something that broke my heart. Sarah, the secret sister, desperately needed a kidney transplant. She had asked Arthur for help months ago, but he had refused to even get tested, claiming he was too important for surgery. I didn't hesitate. I contacted Sarah and told her I would pay for her private medical care and the best surgeons in the state. I called Arthur one last time just to tell him the news. I'm spending every cent of your inheritance on the daughter you tried to hide and abandon, I told him. I'm using your legacy to save the person you treated like a secret shame. The silence on the other end of the phone was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. A week later, I hosted another dinner. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. Sarah sat at the head of the table in Arthur's old chair, looking stronger and happier than she ever had. Pete was there, but he wasn't sitting. He was wearing an apron and serving the food like a silent waiter. Mindy was in the kitchen, her hands red from scrubbing the mountain of greasy dishes. It was the only way I would allow her to stay in the guest room. Suddenly, a shadow appeared at the dining room window.
It was Arthur.
He looked thin and haggard, tapping on the glass and begging for a warm plate of food. I didn't say a word. I simply stood up, grabbed the heavy velvet handles, and closed the curtains tight. Closing the curtains wasn't enough. I wanted Arthur to pay for the beauty he killed. I sat down with my lawyer and filed a massive lawsuit against him. I sued him for the environmental and emotional destruction of my heritage garden. We brought in an expert who valued mature, 20-year-old rose bushes at an astronomical price. These weren't just plants, they were my mother's legacy, and the law saw them as high-value property. Arthur tried to laugh it off from his motel room, but the laughter stopped when the court papers arrived. Because of the fraud I had uncovered earlier, a judge placed an immediate lien on his remaining secret bank account. Every penny he had hidden away was now frozen solid, waiting to pay for the dirt and the roses he had treated like trash. The house felt like a fortress, but I knew Pete was still playing both sides. I decided to test his loyalty one last time. I told him I was leaving on a 3-day business trip to the city. "Keep an eye on the garden, Pete," I said, watching his eyes dart toward the front door. "And remember, no visitors." I didn't actually go to the city. I checked into a hotel 5 minutes away and opened my laptop. I had installed motion-activated sirens and high-definition cameras in the craft room, the very room Arthur tried to steal. I watched the screen as night fell. Sure enough, at midnight, I saw 2 shadows moving through the backyard. Pete was leading Arthur toward the house, whispering about how they would take back what was theirs while I was away. Do you think a husband deserves a second chance after bringing an enemy into your home? Hit subscribe for the final justice. At exactly 2 a.m., the quiet night exploded. I tapped a button on my phone, and the house erupted in a symphony of high-pitched sirens and flashing red lights. I watched the camera as Pete and Arthur jumped in terror. They were halfway through the craft room window when the noise hit them. Within minutes, 3 police cruisers screamed into the driveway, their blue lights reflecting off the windows. I pulled up to the curb just as the officers were pulling Pete and Arthur out of the bushes. Arthur was tangled in the curtains, looking pathetic. "He's my father," Pete screamed, his face red with tears and desperation. "He has a right to be here." The officer didn't even look at him. "He's a trespasser on private property," the officer replied, clicking the handcuff shut. The next morning, I didn't go to the garden. I went to the police station. Pete was sitting on a cold bench, looking exhausted and broken. He looked up at me, probably expecting me to bail him out like I always did. Instead, I reached into my bag and handed him a thick envelope. It wasn't bail money. It was the final divorce papers. "I wanted a partner, Pete," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "I wanted a man who would stand by me. Instead, I got a host for a parasite." Pete started to sob, realizing that the house, the money, and the wife who saved him were all gone. I leaned in close and whispered the final blow. "I'm selling the mansion, Pete. I'm moving to a place you and your father will never find." Mindy tried to put up one last fight. She hired a cheap lawyer and tried to sue me for mental anguish because I had repossessed her car and kicked her out. She claimed I had ruined her life and her reputation. My lawyer just smiled and opened a folder on the table. He laid out the photos I had taken of the Mindy's post-it notes she had stuck all over my furniture. "This isn't mental anguish," my lawyer told her. "This is clear evidence of your intent to steal property that did not belong to you." The threat of a countersuit for attempted grand larceny made her face turn white. Mindy was forced to settle immediately, signing a document that required her to pay every cent of my legal fees. Arthur was finally out of options. With his secret accounts frozen and his membership revoked, he was forced to move into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The walls were thin, and the carpet smelled like old grease. The landlord was a woman I knew very well from my years of charity work. She was famous for her strict enforcement of every single rule. I had personally recommended Arthur to her, telling her he needed a place that would teach him about boundaries. Now, Arthur had to share a cramped kitchen and a single bathroom with 3 other men he considered beneath him. He spent his evenings listening to their loud music instead of sipping Merlot in my dining room. He was finally living the life of a guest in a place where no one cared about his name. While Arthur struggled in his tiny room, I returned to the muddy hole in my yard. I hired a world-class landscaper who specialized in historic gardens. I told him money was no object, I wanted my mother's spirit back. In just 48 hours, the mud was gone. A paradise of mature, blooming roses appeared, their petals soft and fragrant in the morning sun. I placed a small stone bench in the center and dedicated the space to my mother's memory. As I was helping the crew move some soil, my shovel hit something hard. I reached down and pulled out a heavy gold watch. It was the expensive timepiece Arthur had claimed I stole from him years ago. He had actually dropped it in the mud while he was busy destroying my life. I didn't keep the watch as a trophy. I took it straight to the precinct. I used the recovered watch to prove that Arthur had filed a false police report against me years prior. When he had accused me of theft back then, it had almost cost me my job and my reputation. Now, the truth was out. This discovery destroyed his remaining credibility with the law. The judge was furious at being lied to for so long. Arthur didn't go to jail, but he faced a very hefty fine that drained his last bit of cash. He was also sentenced to 100 hours of community service. Every Saturday morning, Arthur had to wear an orange vest and pick up trash along the highway, right where all his old friends could see him. If you love seeing a liar finally get caught in his own trap, hit subscribe for the ending. The most beautiful part of my new life was Sarah. She recovered from her kidney surgery with a speed that amazed the doctors. She looked like a different person, vibrant, healthy, and full of hope. I didn't just pay for her medical bills, I gave her a high-level job at my firm. She was smart, hardworking, and loyal, everything Pete and Mindy were not. We became the real family that Arthur used to brag about, but our bond was built on truth instead of blood. One sunny afternoon, we took a photo together in front of the blooming rose garden. We were both smiling, looking like sisters. We posted it online with the simple caption, "True Blood." I knew Arthur would see it from his tiny apartment, and I knew it would sting. The mansion was beautiful, but it held too many echoes of Arthur's voice and Pete's lies. I decided it was time to move on to a new chapter. I didn't sell the house to another greedy family. Instead, I sold it at a discount to a local developer who was going to turn the entire estate into a shelter for displaced women. The master suite where Arthur tried to sleep would now hold beds for mothers who had nowhere else to go. I walked through the empty, echoing halls one last time. I felt the weight of 20 years of gaslighting finally lift off my shoulders. I wasn't the help anymore. I was the architect of my own freedom. I locked the front door for the last time, feeling a peace I hadn't known in decades. I was halfway through packing my car for my new home when my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Arthur. I almost deleted it, but I decided to listen one last time. His voice was sobbing and weak, broken by the reality of his new life. "I'm sorry, Linda," he choked out between gasps. "Please, I'm your family. I have nothing left. Pete won't even talk to me. Just let me come home." I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I didn't feel a moment of hesitation. I didn't call him back to argue or to gloat. I simply typed out a short message and hit send. My text was short and final. Error 404. Family not found. Then, I blocked his number forever, cutting the last string that tied me to his darkness. I pulled out of the driveway, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple in my rearview mirror. I looked at the house one last time, seeing the new sign for the women's shelter being tucked into the grass. Arthur wanted to toast to the real blood that Thanksgiving. He didn't realize that blood doesn't make you family, loyalty does. He had plenty of true blood, but he ended up as a mun with absolutely no one to bleed for him. I had lost a husband and a home, but I had gained my soul and a sister who actually cared. I stepped on the gas, ready for a life where I was never a guest. "Happy Thanksgiving, Arthur," I whispered to the wind. "Enjoy your TV dinner." "Thank you." Please like, share and subscribe for more. Also turn on your notification bell so you be the first to get our next shocking revenge story.